Mike'sMastermind.com. I've been recording a few of these, just haven't been uploading them. Just can't keep up with the pace. I just got back from Chicago, and I did from Chicago, just before en route back home last night, a recording on tides. I think tides is kind of important. This relates to what the whole premise of my pseudo podcast on philosophy is about. Examining the Weltschloss. In this instance, we are in the world dwelling and going deeper in this regard that we are welded. We're in the world and we're having an experience. We're in this association of the world that we've created and the experience of it. So imagine now, okay, this is a philosophical podcast, so you gotta also do a Gedenken with me, and a Gedenken is the German word for just really imagining and thinking. So this becomes a thought experiment, Gedenken experiment. And this is really, we're just kind of using the power of imagination. And so I'm going to tie in a couple ideas here to sort of premise this out. So yesterday I talked about tides because I had a sense in experiencing this world-dwelling experience. There are sensations, and you could say there are tides, waves, whether it would be of time, right? It's just sort of the sensation that's felt within a space, which I describe as metasphere, sort of the atmosphere between us. Let's quantify it. At the same time, in the spatial dynamic, we have a relationship, and there is going to be some energy, and this energetic could be emotions, sort of empathy perhaps to the experience, and the examination, the willingness to explore. And then what matters, right? So it could be what's in the mind, could be issues of money, or it just could be sort of just the moment that we're in. So I've just given you the mess analogy backwards, time, space, energy, and matter, where I've always talked about it in the other way, MEST. So this dynamic of a tide would sort of be a flotation, and oftentimes I've talked about buoyancy. There seems to be some kind of, within the currency of our exchange, there is a current, this dynamic, whether it be MEST, is sort of a felt, and the felt is part of this network universe that we have of what is being experienced. You can imagine felt in different dimensions, right? So it's a fabric. And this MEST analogy is explaining Weltschloss in the sensation of our being able to identify it. And then within this realm, there's a reach. And the reach into this dynamic is an exploration. And it should be something in its dynamic that's revealing. And as it's revealing, it's also what I talk about clearing, a clarification or a reckoning, and I'm spelling the reckoning with a W. So it's tearing down the old and the previous paradigm, which was really, it might have in its time served its purpose and intent, but we have more an experience of where it's like, wow, it's no longer serving us, right? It's been a stodgy paradigm of limitation and sort of structure institutionalizing us. So either we get serious about dismantling, or at the very least, and I don't like the word reform, but make it functional, so there can be some aspect of being able to move ahead or beyond it, or use it constructively in the experience analogy that's going to allow us to now have this sense of enlightenment. And this is freedom, at least the quest, and you could say the journey, and having it recognized as experiential is going to sort of recognize that we're also in this tide or this current. And so I talked about the tide model, which I didn't know it existed until I got curious about this tide concept. Now, in Eckankar, I talk about the ocean of love and mercy, as well as ancient traditions, and I think it's in the Vedic philosophy, at least that's how I was taught. So in this vast oceanness, and you could say it's just the expansive universe, there's this dynamic and this fabric of interconnectivity that at least we can define from a physics point of view, which is solid science, just MEST, matter, energy, space, and time. So how it's felt or impacted in the psychological realm is this other dimension then, that I come to recognize that if we're not careful can lead to morbidity, not only of you and I, the us, but our species. And so relevant the importance and concern to have this connectivity again, because now it becomes cosmologically aligned to something that's of a greater purpose, which is our self-discovery, our true self-discovery, that now becomes this enlightenment, if we're going to use this term. So the reflection on this, which I talk about in this pseudo podcast on philosophy is ultra beingness. It's the question to ask, like, well, at the high tide, when I rise up to the occasion, when I'm in state, when I feel like I'm in flow and have this momentum, or I'm tapped into the universe, whatever it is for you, right? This instateness is what I describe as an ultra beingness. Could be similar again to Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He talked about that pyramid, the bottom of survival, struggle to the pinnacle peak, which is self-actualization, but also in this realm, transcendence, what's above and beyond, if we're going to frame it. So if there could be this fabric dimension of things that are felt, and the way that we can now better relate to each other, because what's revealed in the Weld Slosh is enabling us to gain sort of the greater perspective, the wider lens, you could say. At the same time, we can zero in, point at something, and without going into instant reaction, it's just simply recognition. And now, in this Weld Slosh revelation, it opens up to be realized and experienced just for what it is. Now, it could be termed and then labeled and perhaps limited, but then we see it, that maybe there's something here that was a lesson, and we can expand on this perhaps. There has to be a willingness and sort of some kind of acceptance in this regard that I'll consider it in this dimension or on that level. Otherwise, you kind of can't go there. I mean, you can argue the point and try to help and pivot the person to see your point of view, but if they don't, because they don't want to, or they just don't get it, and they don't see it, you can't weigh in them too much, right? I mean, you sense it out, you go with the flow again, and you tap back into it when the moment or the opportunity is right, and you might have to wait a few lifetimes. Isn't that the test? So whatever this would be, this tide, there's sort of this recognition that, as we go with the flow and be in the moment, we can also do what I call set sail, and that was sort of the discovery this morning, thinking of it like, well, if you're going to have a tide, well, do you just rock back and forth and as you go with the flow, or can we also sail? And sail, yeah, I'm using sailing, boating analogies, but we're just sort of examining something that, as we think about these currents, whether they be cosmic currents, there's a space, right, a cosmic wind. So this dynamic that we could sort of measure, and I talk about this in a whole other talk, which I really need to flesh out more, called ARF, right? The arena ratio fields of this sort of experience of what we're tapping into. This is sort of like a radio receiver. And as we interpret and sort of granularly filter and measure out, we come to sort of something, right? A recognition, what was revealed, but how it was revealed, in its dimension and color and texture. And what does that deliver in terms of semiotics, which means the meaning of signs or how we interpret them, because we've been inculcated, right? We've all been sort of commissioned in this life. In this cringe analogy, I write at cringefactors.com, and I'll clarify this, talking about this sailing aspect, what we're sailing right into, becomes a dynamic of judgment, something that's preconditioned for us, right? We have really great words we're talking about, and some of this is new terminology that I've come up with because I want to cut through that clutter. Some people might say I'm adding more into the disarray and confusion. Well, the whole idea, if I term something, is to shed a light on it, to clarify it, and adding, whatever analogy or what I'm associating to it is to help with the revelation that if we immediately begin to name it and term it, what is it that we're trying to say about it? And it could be based on belief, right? This is what I believe, but also that belief might have been given to you. And so you just accepted it. You never sort of questioned it. Or perhaps you were afraid to sort of challenge it because of some consequence that's imagined, or just that you'd be judged. So wouldn't that imprison you? And I thought like how we're coming to this dimension of the tide and the quality of the sail, and where we are in the arena ratio field, we have something that we could recognize of the prism that we're in. Now, careful of the word. I know a lot of people in the self-help movement want to use the word like we're in some kind of inhumane prison of our own mind. Well, you get that analogy. That's pretty limiting to begin with. Now you're going to break out of your own prison, your own jail cell that you've jailed yourself. So you're going to break yourself out? How does that work? Well, read my IGO work. That's where I got to go. IGOISM.com. The IGO, where I go in my imagination, that projected sense of self, the selfie of the mind. How do we see ourselves, and how do we portray it in that? Either it's just in that fantasy world, or we play it out in quote-unquote real life, where most people just are living a noun reality, What's noun to them is just people, places, and things, and they play it over and over in their mind like an RTP, which stands for repeated thought pattern. And to not recognize it, where do you go with it then? So at high tide and the proper sail within this, you could say, an equilibrium now exists because you can recognize it for what it is. And you still could judge it, but you got to be careful. You go too yin, you're too yang, left or right. You have to stay centered as best you can. See it from not just both, but all sides. You get a proper view on things. And then you can take a position because you can now properly see it. Well, that's where I was with tide, So if we can rise at high tide and check out the tide model, which has to do with mental health. I already talked about this yesterday, so please check it out. All right, I got to take this call. Thank you. So, of course, I use these analogies, right? Tide and sail. We're talking things that are metaphorical. That's why I reference this metasphere, this what is the quality of what we're feeling could be part of, the narrative that's nationally being felt, whether it's related to natural disasters or just the trend and what's popular or what's going on politically or controversially. So these things, are just part of that element. So sort of to get a bit more descriptive might help us understand what we're projecting, whether it's in the ego, right, the image of me in my mind and whatever situation or things that I'm relating to are projected. They're expressed in a certain way, whether outwardly or back towards us. So to have a fine understanding is to sort of, it's what you do if you're sort of a social scientist, or in this case, pseudo-philosopher. Looking at some ideas, like if we quantify and qualify enlightenment, what are the different dimensions of this and what it could be? And then, of course, it's about the possibility of it being lived and expressed. And how would this work? So to me, it's just profound to be able to talk about it. So a community conversation, a loving conversation, just something that cosmically connects. That, to me, is the aspiration, right? It's like, well, we could talk about the weather or sports or some other trivia, and it's all fine and good, right? I want to do a new podcast next year. Brand, it's just sort of something that's sort of on target to what would be branded in the podcast world. Okay, it's got the pseudo-philosophy. What else does he want to do? Got a lot of ideas. And to me, it's about self-liberation. So we get out of our story and just start living in our true selves, and the sense of the expression is enlightened. That's the sort of the signature element. So if you could measure out or look at the depth of the tide and sort of the width and expansion of the sail, this sort of in the experience of the realm in which we are, is there something that's going on that we can then tap into in a more enlightened way that gets the benefit or the best? I'm talking about the experience. So it's what you're giving, but also obviously what you're receiving. And you are sort of the attuner of this. If you look at these ideas in this capacity, and maybe, you might be more of a sensitive person of what you feel or what you hear in something that's being said, right? And this affinity to whatever draws you, you have a sense of this. This is the Welt slosh opening up that becomes relevation, and not just talking, quote unquote new age ideas here. We're talking about something that is really experienced in a level that it's like, I understand, because you're living it, you're experiencing it, and you're tapped into it. This is ultra beingness, at least quantifying, qualifying it. So why not explore it from this dimension so you have your own definition, proof of this brand experience of you. And so things might change, right? You have an adjustment because hey, that old paradigm structure does need to be reckoned with because it no longer works. It inhibits. So how can we do it elegantly, bring it down to where there is this equilibrium and this tide now that raises up everyone in the affairs of our experience? So you kind of shake it off, and what didn't work in the past no longer is confrontational because you dealt with it. Or it's over. So now it's something new. And that's what this work presents, at least ideally, right? Mike'sMastermind.com, just food for consideration. You can get some more of these at the podcast, Mike'sMastermind.com, and also a tidbit sampling of the writings, sort of a smorgasbord platter that's presented. Take your sampling at grandtourideas.com, grandtourideas.com. I'm Mike Ratner,